Hey everyone, so there are a couple of things that you've already been learning, and these are vital. And the first one is learning about context. That when we pull a verse out of context, we can make it say almost anything we want it to say. However, when we put the verse back into context and we're asking the question, what did the author mean? That means we're going to look at the context. We're going to allow the verses that come before and after. If we've got time, like you've done with the book of Philippians, we're going to try and get an overview of the whole book. And that's going to help us understand where this particular verse fits in. And that's going to shape our understanding. And therefore, we're going to be far more responsible with regards to our engagement with Scripture. So context is the first thing that we've been learning. The second thing is what I'm hoping has been happening is that you've been growing your powers of observation. Instead of reading a verse and taking out the superficial meaning of it, you've been looking at it, you've been looking at it again and again and again, squeezing it for all it's worth and coming away with a far richer understanding of what is being meant in that particular verse. And I really want to encourage you to take that with you for the rest of your life. But now today, although you spent a lot of time in the book of Philippians, we're going to be moving to a different genre, particularly the genre of historical narrative. And that's just a fancy way of talking about those books of the Bible that are recording history. So for example, in the Old Testament, we've been going through the book of Exodus. We've got the book of Joshua and Judges. In the New Testament, we've got the book of Acts, and that is where we're going to go today. And Luke actually tells us that he went and researched this thing. Luke spent a lot of time with Paul, and he is literally just recording the historical events of what happened in the life of the early church in the book of Acts. So one of the things that we need to learn to do when reading a book like the book of Exodus or a book like the book of Acts is the difference between a text that is descriptive versus a text that is prescriptive. Sometimes the author is simply describing what happened, no more, no less. If you tell your wife that you went to the grocery store to buy A, B, and C, there's no deeper meaning, there's no deeper symbolism in that. You are simply recounting or describing, I went to the grocery store and the following happened. And there are lots of these kinds of descriptive moments in these books in the genre of historical narrative. And we would make a massive mistake by trying to read too much into that. However, there are moments, and we've seen them in the book of Exodus, and we're going to see them in the book of Acts, where the author is also prescribing something. In other words, not only am I telling you what happened, but this is also for you. And the way we know the difference is in the prescriptive sections. There are principles to be applied, and we will see those very same principles being taught about more clearly in other parts of Scripture. And so I want to give you an example that doesn't come from the book of Acts, but in the book of 2 Timothy, towards the end, Paul says to Timothy, please go and fetch my cloak. Now, do we need to spend every single day of the rest of our lives picking up people's cloaks as a result of our obedience to this principle? No. This is Paul simply describing a moment that's a once-off event. However, in 2 Timothy chapter 3, Paul, in talking about Scripture, he says that all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching and correcting and rebuking and training in righteousness. Now, that's a universal teaching. That's a universal principle that is taught on elsewhere in Scripture. So one is descriptive and the second is prescriptive. And so what we're going to do in this week's lesson is that we're going to spend a bit of time in the book of Acts. We're going to briefly, don't go too far into it, we're going to briefly look at a descriptive passage, and then we're going to dive into a prescriptive passage, a passage that you may know quite well, but a passage that is so rich with principles that you and I can live out and apply into our lives today.